All right, welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Today, we'll be continuing our series on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations with our third episode in the series on Chapter 11, which is entitled Of the Rent of Land. We are in the middle of Part 3 of the variations in the proportion between the respective values of that sort of produce which always affords rent and of that which sometimes does and sometimes does not afford rent. Within that third part, we are on a subsection on the digression concerning the variations in the value of silver during the course of the 4 last centuries. Smith divides this history up into 3 periods. Today we will be beginning the third period. It's about 24 pages, so we should be able to get halfway through it today. As I've said before on this subsection, it's a bit of a slog. It's a historical slog. So I will be linking to Chapter 12 as we finish off Chapter 11 here. In the description of this video. So without further ado, the third period. Between 1630 and 1640, or about 1636, the effect of the discovery of the mines of America in reducing the value of silver appears to have been completed, and the value of that metal seems never to have sunk lower in proportion to that of corn than it was about that time. It seems to have risen somewhat in the course of the present century, and it had probably begun to do so even some time before the end of the last. From 1637 to 1700, both inclusive, being the 64 last years of the last century, the average price of the quarter of 9 bushels of the best wheat at Windsor Market appears, from the same accounts, to have been £2 11 shillings and 1/3 pence, which is only 1 shilling and 1/3 pence dearer than it had been during the 16 years before. But in the course of these 64 years, there happened 2 events which must have produced a much greater scarcity of corn than what the course of the seasons would otherwise have occasioned, and which, therefore, without supposing any further reduction in the value of silver, will much more than account for this very small enhancement of price. The first of these events was the Civil War, which by discouraging tillage and interrupting commerce must have raised the price of corn much above what the course of the seasons would otherwise have occasioned. It must have had this effect, more or less, at all the different markets in the kingdom, but particularly at those in the neighborhood of London, which required to be supplied from the greatest distance. In 1648, accordingly, the price of the best wheat at Windsor Market appears, from the same accounts, to have been £4 5 shillings, and in 1649 to have been £4 the quarter of 9 bushels. The excess of those 2 years above £2 10 shillings, the average price of the 16 years preceding 1637, is £3 5 shillings, which, divided among the 64 last years of the last century, will alone very nearly account for that small enhancement of price which seems to have taken place in them. These, however, though the highest, are by no means the only prices which seem to have been occasioned by the civil wars. The second event was the bounty upon the exportation of corn, granted in 1688. The bounty, it has been thought by many people, by encouraging tillage, may in a long course of years have occasioned a greater abundance, and consequently a greater cheapness of corn in the home market than what would otherwise have taken place there. How far the bounty could produce this effect at any time, I shall examine hereafter. I shall only observe at present that between 1688 and 1700, it had not time to produce any such effect. During this short period, its only effect must have been, by encouraging the exportation of the surplus produce of every year, and thereby hindering the abundance from one year from compensating the scarcity of another, to raise the price in the home market. The scarcity which prevailed in England from 1693 to 1699, both inclusive, though no doubt principally owing to the badness of the seasons, and therefore extending through a considerable part of Europe, must have been somewhat enhanced by the bounty. In 1699, accordingly, the further exportation of corn was prohibited for 9 months. There was a third event which occurred in the course of the same period, and which, though it could not occasion any scarcity of corn, nor perhaps any augmentation in the real quantity of silver which was usually paid for it, must necessarily have occasioned some augmentation in the nominal sum. This event was the great debasement of the silver coin, by clipping and wearing. This evil had begun in the reign of Charles II, and had gone on continually increasing till 1695, at which time, as we may learn from Mr. Lowndes, the current silver coin was, at an average, nearly 25% below its standard value. But the nominal sum which constitutes the market price of every commodity is necessarily regulated not so much by the quantity of silver, which, according to the standard, ought to be contained in it, as by that which, it is found by experience, actually is contained in it. The nominal sum, therefore, is necessarily higher when the coin is much debased by clipping and wearing than when near to its standard value. In the course of the present century, the silver coin has not at any time been more below its standard weight than it is at present. But though very much defaced, its value has been kept up by that of the gold coin for which it is exchanged. For though before the late recoinage the coin was a good deal defaced too, it was less so than the silver. In 1695, on the contrary, the value of the silver coin was not kept by the gold coin, a guinea then commonly exchanging for 30 shillings of the worn and clipped silver. Before the late recoinage of the gold, the price of silver bullion was seldom higher than 5 shillings and 7 pence an ounce, which is but 5 pence above the mint price. But in 1695, the common price of silver bullion was 6 shillings and 5 pence an ounce, which is 15 pence above the mint price. Even before the late recoinage of the gold, therefore, the coin, gold and silver together, when compared with silver bullion, was not supposed to be more than 8% below its standard value. In 1695, on the contrary, it had been supposed to be near 50 and 20% below that value. But in the beginning of the present century, that is, immediately after the great recoinage in King William's time, the greater part of the current silver coin must have been still nearer to its standard weight than it is at present. In the course of the present century, too, there has been no great public calamity such as the Civil War, which could either discourage tillage or interrupt the interior commerce of that country. And though the bounty which has taken place through the greater part of this century must always raise the price of corn somewhat higher than it would be in the actual state of tillage, yet as, in the course of this century, the bounty has had full time to produce all the good effects commonly imputed to it, to encourage tillage, and thereby to increase the quantity of corn in the home market, it may, upon the principles of a system which I shall explain and examine hereafter, be supposed to have done something to lower the price of that commodity the one way, as well as to raise it in the other. It is by many people supposed to have done more. In the 64 first years of the present century, accordingly, the average price of the quarter of 9 bushels of the best wheat at Windsor market appears, by the accounts of Eton College, to have been £2 6 pence and 19/32 of a pence, which is about 10 shillings and 6 pence, or more than 25% cheaper than it had been during the 64 last years of the last century, and about 9 shillings and 6 pence cheaper than it had been during the 16 years preceding 1636, when the discovery of the abundant mines of America may be supposed to have produced its full effect, and about 1 shilling cheaper than it had been in the 26 years preceding 1620, before that discovery can well be supposed to have produced its full effect. According to this account, the average price of middle wheat during the 64 first years of the present century comes out to have been about 32 shillings the quarter of 8 bushels. The value of silver, therefore, seems to have risen somewhat in proportion to that of corn during the course of the present century, and it had probably begun to do so even sometime before the end of the last. In 1687, the price of the quarter of 9 bushels of the best wheat at Windsor market was £1 5 shillings 2 pence, the lowest price at which it had ever been from 1595. In 1688, Mr. Gregory King, a man famous for his knowledge in matters of this kind, estimated the average price of wheat in years of moderate plenty to be to the grower 3 shillings 6 pence the bushel, or 8 shillings the quarter. The grower's price I understand to be the same with what is sometimes called the contract price, or the price at which a farmer contracts for a certain number of years to deliver a certain quantity of corn to a dealer. As a contract of this kind saves the farmer the expense and trouble of marketing, the contract price is generally lower than what is supposed to be the average market price. Mr. King had judged 8 shillings the quarter to be at that time the ordinary contract price in years of moderate plenty. Before the scarcity occasioned by the late extraordinary course of bad seasons, it was, I have been assured, the ordinary contract price in all common years. In 1688 was granted the parliamentary bounty upon the exportation of corn. The country gentlemen, who then composed a still greater proportion of the legislature than they do at present, had felt that the money price of corn was falling. The bounty was an expedient to raise it artificially to the high price at which it had frequently been sold in the times of Charles I and Charles II. It was to take place, therefore, till wheat was so high as 48 shillings the quarter, that is, 20 shillings or 5/7 the dearer than Mr. King had in the very years estimated the grower's price to be in times of moderate plenty. If his calculations deserve any part of the reputation which they have obtained very universally, 48 shillings the quarter was a price which, without some expedient as the bounty, could not at that time be expected except in the years of extraordinary scarcity. But the government of King William was not then fully settled. It was in no condition to refuse anything to the country gentlemen, from whom it was at that very time soliciting the first establishment of the annual land tax. The value of silver, therefore, in proportion to that of corn, had probably risen somewhat before the end of the last century, and it seems to have continued to do so during the course of the greater part of the present, though the necessary operation of the bounty must have hindered that rise from being so sensible as it otherwise would have been in the actual state of tillage. In plentiful years, the bounty, by occasioning an extraordinary exportation, necessarily raises the price of corn above what it otherwise would be in those years. To encourage tillage, by keeping up the price of corn even in the most plentiful years, it was the avowed end of the institution. In years of great scarcity, indeed, the bounty has generally been suspended. It must, however, have had some effect even upon the prices of many of those years. By the extraordinary exportation which it occasions in years of plenty, it must frequently hinder the plenty of one year from compensating the scarcity of another. Both in years of plenty and in years of scarcity, therefore, the bounty raises the price of corn above what it naturally would be in the actual state of tillage. If, during the 64 first years of the present century, therefore, the average price has been lower than during the 64 last years of the last century, it must, in the same state of tillage, have been much more so had it not been for this operation of the bounty. But without the bounty, it may be said, the state of tillage would not have been the same. What may have been the effects of this institution upon the agriculture of the country, I shall endeavor to explain hereafter, when I come to treat particularly of bounties. I shall only observe at present that this rise in the value of silver in proportion to that of corn has not been peculiar to England. It has been observed to have taken place in France during the same period, and nearly in the same proportion too, by three very faithful, diligent, and laborious collectors of the prices of corn, Mr. Dupré de Semoir, Mr. Messence, and the author of the Essay on the Police of Grain. But in France, till 1764, the exportation of grain was by law prohibited, and it is somewhat difficult to suppose that nearly the same diminution of price which took place in one country, notwithstanding this prohibition, should in another be owing to the extraordinary encouragement given to exportation. It would be more proper, perhaps, to consider this variation in the average money price of corn as the effect rather effect rather of some gradual rise in the real value of silver in the European market than of any fall in the real average value of corn. Corn, it has already been observed, is at distant periods of time a more accurate measure of value than either silver or perhaps any other commodity. When, after the discovery of the abundant mines of America, corn rose to 3 and 4 times its former money price, this change was universally ascribed not to any rise in the real value of corn, but to a fall in the real value of silver. If during the 64 first years of the present century, therefore, the average money price of corn has fallen somewhat below what it had been during the greater part of the last century, we should in the same manner impute this change not to any fall in the real value of corn, but to some rise in the real value of silver in the European market. The high price of corn during these 10 or 12 years past, indeed, has occasioned a suspicion that the real value of silver still continues to fall in the European market. This high price of corn, however, seems evidently to have been the effect of the extraordinary unfavorableness of the seasons, and ought therefore to be regarded not as a permanent, but as a transitory and occasional event. The seasons for these 10 or 12 years past have been unfavorable through the greater part of Europe, and the disorders of Poland have very much increased the scarcity in all these countries which, in dear years, used to be supplied from that market. So long a course of bad seasons, though not a very common event, is by no means a singular one, and whoever has inquired much into the history of the prices of corn in former times will be at no loss to recollect several other examples of the same kind. 10 years of extraordinary scarcity, besides, are not more wonderful than 10 years of extraordinary plenty. The low price of corn from 1741 to 1750, both inclusive, may very well be set in opposition to its high price during these last 8 or 10 years. From 1741 to 1750, the average price of the quarter of 9 bushels of the best wheat at Windsor Market, it appears from the accounts of Eton College, was only £1, 13 shillings and 9 4/5 pence, which is nearly 6 shillings and 3 pence below the average price of the 64 years of the present century. The average price of the quarter of 8 bushels of middle wheat comes out, according to this account, to have been, during these 10 years, only £1, 6 shillings and 8 pence. Between 1741 and 1750, however, the bounty must have hindered the price of corn from falling so low in the home market as it naturally would have done. During these 10 years, the quantity of all sorts of grain exported, it appears from the custom house books, amounted to no less than 8,029,156 quarters 1 bushel. The bounty paid for this amounted to 1,514,962 pounds, 17 shillings and 4.5 pence. In 1749, accordingly, Mr. Pelham, at the time Prime Minister, observed to the House of Commons that for the 3 years preceding, a very extraordinary sum had been paid as bounty for the exportation of corn. He had good reason to make this observation, and in the following year he might have had still better. In that single year, the bounty paid amounted to no less than 324,176 pounds, 10 shillings and 6 pence. It is unnecessary to observe how much this forced exportation must have raised the price of corn above what it otherwise would have been in the home market. At the end of the accounts annexed to this chapter, the reader will find the particular account of those 10 years separated from the rest. He will find there, too, the particular account of the preceding 10 years, of which the average is likewise below, though not so much below, the general average of the 64 first years of the century. The year 1740, however, was a year of extraordinary scarcity. These 20 years preceding 1750 may very well be set in opposition to the 20 preceding 1770. As the former were a good deal below the general average of the century, notwithstanding the intervention of 1 or 2 dear years, so the latter have been a good deal above it, notwithstanding the intervention of 1 or 2 cheap ones of 1759, for example. If the former have not been as much below the general average as the latter have been above it, we ought probably to impute it to the bounty. The change has evidently been too sudden to be ascribed to any change in the value of silver, which is always slow and gradual. The suddenness of the effect can be accounted for only by a cause which can operate suddenly, the accidental variations of the seasons. The money price of labor in Great Britain has, indeed, risen during the course of the present century. This, however, seems to be the effect not so much of any diminution in the value of silver in the European market, as of an increase in the demand for labor in Great Britain, arising from the great and almost universal prosperity of the country. In France, a country not altogether so prosperous, the money price of labor has, since the middle of the last century, been observed to sink gradually with the average money price of corn. Both in the last century and in the present, the day wages of common labor are there said to have been pretty uniformly about the 20th part of the average price of the septier of wheat, a measure which contains a little more than 4 Winchester bushels. In Great Britain, the real recompense of labor, it has already been shown, the real quantities of the necessaries and conveniency of life which are given to the laborer, has increased considerably during the course of the present century. The rise in its money price seems to have been the effect not of any diminution of the value of silver in the general market of Europe, but of a rise in the real price of labor in the particular market of Great Britain, owing to the peculiarly happy circumstances of the country. For some time after the first discovery of America, silver would continue to sell at its former, or not much below its former price. The profits of mining would for some time be very great, and much above their natural rate. Those who imported that metal into Europe, however, would soon find that the whole annual importation could not be disposed of at this high price. Silver would gradually exchange for a smaller and a smaller quantity of goods. Its price would sink gradually lower and lower till it fell to its natural price, or to what was just sufficient to pay, according to their natural rates, the wages of the labor, the profits of the stock, and the rent of the land, which must be paid in order to bring it from the mine to the market. In the greater part of the silver mines of Peru, the tax of the King of Spain, amounting to 1/10 of the gross produce, eats up, it has already been observed, the whole rent of the land. This tax was originally 1/2. It soon afterwards fell to 1/3, then to 1/5, and at last to 1/10, at which rate it still continues. In the greater part of the silver mines of Peru, this, it seems, is all that remains, after replacing the stock of the undertaker of the work, together with its ordinary profits. And it seems to be universally acknowledged that these profits, which were once very high, are now as low as they can well be, consistently with carrying on the works. The tax of the King of Spain was reduced to 1/5 part of the registered silver in 1504, 1 in 40 years before 1545, the date of the discovery of the mines of Potosi. In the course of 90 years, or before 1636, these mines, the most fertile in all America, had time sufficient to produce their full effect, or to reduce the value of silver in the European market as low as it could well fall, while it continued to pay this tax to the King of Spain. 90 years is time sufficient to reduce any commodity of which there is no monopoly to its natural price, or to the lowest price at which, while it pays a particular tax, it can continue to be sold for any considerable time together. The price of silver in the European market might perhaps have fallen still lower, and it might have become necessary either to reduce the tax upon it, not only to 1/10 as in 1736, but to 1/20 in the same manner as at that upon gold, or to give up working the greater part of the American mines which are now wrought. The gradual increase of the demand for silver, or the gradual enlargement of the market for the produce of the silver mines of America, is probably the cause which it has prevented this from happening, and which has not only kept up the value of silver in the European market, but has perhaps even raised it somewhat higher than it was about the middle of the last century. Okay, so that's probably a good stopping point. I'll just read this next sentence here. Since the first discovery of America, the market for the produce of its silver mines has been growing gradually more and more extensive. And then he goes on to describe that in the next part. So this is probably a good stopping point. We'll just have to reread that sentence tomorrow as we begin the second half of this subsection within part 3 of chapter 11. So until then, this has been Mike from Mike Reads, signing off.